I wanted to talk about Putin's speech. I watched quite a bit of it. It seemed to be a lot of repeating the same old, but there is some areas of it that I thought were interesting and response to American diplomatic inquiries. So I wanted to respond both to the speech and the inquiries, talk about it, and I'll say what I think it says. But I think that the best, summation of it was put out by Steve Rosenberg. As always, massive Steve Rosenberg fan, one of the few decent journalists left in Moscow. Let's have his summation of it play out, and then we can talk about it. Talk about the specifics.
The world has been wondering, is Vladimir Putin ready to end the war, to back the peace plan America and Ukraine have been discussing? No sign he's in a hurry.
Overall, we agree it can be used as a basis for future agreements. But it would be impolite of me to speak about any final versions of a plan, because there are none. It is clear that we need to sit down and discuss some concrete issues. Everything should be put down in diplomatic language.
No compromise from the Kremlin on its key territorial demand that Ukraine simply hand over to Russia the parts of the Donbass Russia's army has so far failed to seize. If Ukraine leaves those territories, hostilities will end, Mr. Putin said. If they don't, we'll make that happen by force. And no desire to sign anything with Ukraine's current leadership, which Mr. Putin dismissed as illegitimate.
Donald Trump has spoken of tremendous progress in peace talks. Vladimir Putin's message wasn't so optimistic. True, the Kremlin leader said he is ready for serious discussions about peace plans, but it's clear he's also ready to continue the war if he doesn't get what he wants.
The war doesn't feel like it's about to end. On the edge of Moscow, we saw the Communist Party dispatching donations to the front line. For Russian troops, everything from biscuits to motorbikes, trench candles, and these accessories for dropping bombs from drones. We will continue to advance, party leader Gennady Zyuganov says. If the Ukrainians don't accept terms now, their losses will be 5 times greater. The Kremlin believes things are going its way now on the battlefield, and therefore that Russia gets to dictate how this war ends.
So the two biggest areas I think that you should pay attention to when it comes to that speech is, number one, is that the Ukrainians need to give up the unoccupied Donbass. Now, look, that in and of itself is not news, but the fact that after the counterproposal has already been made, after the 28-point peace plan was trimmed down to a peace plan that did not include the Ukrainians having to give up the unoccupied Donetsk region, not necessarily having to swear off NATO, increasing the cap from 600,000 to 800,000 when it comes to its armies and how much of an armed force it can keep, depending upon, trying to a war kicking off again, since it was specifically a restriction in peacetime. All these things that have been changed and sent back, him responding by saying, this still has to be withdrawn from. We now know that he is simply not accepting the new proposal. This idea of we're going to have a deal by Thanksgiving obviously did not happen. Thanksgiving was yesterday, but I think that the idea of us getting a deal by Christmas is probably off the table as well, or basically next to impossible. And the reason I would give is just the way that the Kremlin is responding to the counterproposal. Not only are they not really coming out and striking any tone on any issue that's conciliatory, with them coming out and just saying you need to withdraw from these occupied territories, but even going as far to say the Ukrainian government is illegitimate. The Ukrainian government is illegitimate. It's an illegitimate government. It hasn't had these elections, which means that it's not the real government. We in Russia have true democratic elections. Therefore, we're a legitimate government. So we don't really need to recognize anything that they do or anything around them. We don't need to recognize that. And you better withdraw from the occupied positions. And this is something he said during the speech, because we're already advancing in areas like Zaporizhia, because they're currently on the gates of Hule-Pole. That's for the history nerds, that's Nestor Makhno's ancestral home. We're at the gates of Hulipole, and so you don't need to worry about the outcome, Russia, because we will either take it later or we'll take it now through you conceding it, you giving us this, because it will be a worse deal for you later. And so that seemed to be the offer that he's putting forward. So in the context of this position, where he is saying withdraw from occupied positions, not entertaining the peace deal on that level, and he's calling the Ukrainian government illegitimate, so it seems like I don't even recognize the body that we would need to be negotiating with, and we would have to recognize in order to live next to them as as a neighbor state, as two states next to each other. But it's not just these two things. It's, commentary that's completely unconciliatory, not entertaining any of the demands. But at the same time, the Russian Foreign Ministry responded formally to the counterproposal from the United States by saying that they would respond in a week. Now, can I just say, isn't that just silly on its face? Why do they need a week to respond? Why can't it just be sent straight to Putin? He responds instantaneously, and then we have that response funneled back by the afternoon, and then you continue. That's how you would have fast-paced diplomacy, the high-pressure diplomacy Trump has been pushing in order to get something done. When you hear about the Ukrainian side, you hear about this fait accompli over and over again, that they're being basically pushed into this high-pressure scenario where they have to agree to something very quickly or possibly lose support. But when it comes to Russian response times, it's all dependent upon, oh, we'll get back to you in a week. Oh, we'll get back to you next Tuesday. Oh, we'll get back to you next Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, whatever. And it's always can kicking. It comes back to the time-old story for this war of us, just paddling with one oar, but just going in circles, of us just constantly just following the dotted line that just goes around the block over and over again. And that is getting dragged through negotiations where the Russians continue to push the offensives on the battlefront. And while Army Secretary Driscoll is going around to European leaders saying, oh, the Russians have so many long-range missiles at their disposal. They have so many weapons at their disposal. What are you going to do if something happens? Maybe it's better to accept the deal now. We don't have any more capacity to give to you. What message does that send to the Russians? It, in their mind, increases the leverage that they have, and it could even mean that they have less meaning to negotiate, less reason to negotiate. Because what Trump sees as a reasonable deal is not necessarily what the Russians see as a reasonable deal. What Steve Witkoff sees as a reasonable deal, forcing the Ukrainians to give up the Donetsk region, might not be what Europe and Ukraine is willing to accept. And so if the goal is to bring an end to the war, you have to change the conditions on the ground to something that is acceptable. For example, making it so that the Russians, who have failed to take it so far, accept the line as it was. Something much similar to what he was talking about at the start of the war. Hell, it's crazy to say it, but Donald Trump talking about a European peacekeeping force in Ukraine and just freezing the lines where they were. These ideas might not have been perfected. They might not have been detailed. They might have been crude, but they were a lot closer to something that would actually be
morally corrupt,
not only,
bankrupt
I think,
man.
more likely to be accepted by the parties involved, but might actually be more likely to hold up, might actually be more likely to sustain itself. And that all gets me to Donald Trump's announcement about the recognition of territory. So what's being reported right now, and we don't know this for sure, that this is going to be announced formally, because right now we just have reports from the press about what is expected to happen. But this is what's being said is expected to happen. Is that Donald Trump is going to announce his formal recognition of the occupation of Ukrainian territories, i.e., he would basically be saying Putin formally both physically controls Crimea and we recognize that it is Russian. And he's going to repeat that for the occupied Donetsk region, all of the Luhansk region, because all of it is occupied, and for a good chunk of both the Kherson and Zaporizhia region, including the city of Mariupol. And he's going to formally acknowledge that because he thinks that by giving them this compromise, or at least this would be the publicly declared logic, notwithstanding what might actually be going on in his head, The idea is by doing that, we get us closer to peace because of this concession that shows that we're willing to work with them, we're willing to make a deal with them, etc. Now, this just is a loser for everybody. This is a loser for everybody except Putin, in my mind. So why it's a winner for Putin? Putin gets the recognition of territory by a global superpower, including the main superpower that was in opposition to this egregious violation of international norms, law, and morals. And he gets it without having to give up any immediate concession. So from his point of view, that's gold. That's golden. Fantastic. From the Ukrainian point of view, obviously it's awful because the Ukrainian government would see that as giving up leverage, that Trump is saying, okay, fine, that's all yours. And so for the Russians, that could just be, okay, here's where we moved the line to now. Let's see if we can move the line from 20% of Ukraine to 25%, to 30%, and just continuing to move forward those standards. And so the Ukrainians are worried about not only the territory that the United States is now normalizing the occupation of, normalizing that crime, but also the normalization of them doing it again, seeing it as rewarding them. That is also a threat that moves on to Europe. Europe doesn't like it because of those same stated reasons, which could affect other European states like Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Moldova. If this works here, why wouldn't it work in other European states?
A Kurd is a Kurd.
Why redraw this border if you can
YP
redraw that border?
Goldbug has donated $10. Zero.
Point is, if the standard hits here, why wouldn't it also hit in other European states? Thank you for the $10. I do appreciate that, YP Goldbug. Thank you, thank you. So the Europeans obviously are not going to be happy. But when it comes to Trump and his base has been pulled. The American public has been pulled. The majority of Americans do not want to see Ukraine have to give up territory in order to appease the Russians. And not only do the majority of Americans don't want that, the majority of Trump voters don't want that. And it's a clear, vast majority of Trump voters do not want that. So this is something that is unpopular. And so if Trump recognizes it and then the war does not end, so he's done something that is unpopular for a vague gain that you could say, oh, well, now we're closer to the way of peace. But if the war doesn't stop and we have the nightmare scenario of we've given up leverage, we've recognized this territory, and the Russians are just continuing the march forward. So in a year or two, it's going to be okay. Instead of just we're going to have to add another 5% to our 20% recognition, as you've gotten us no closer to peace. That's going to both be unpopular on the action itself and unpopular when it comes to the results. So you've done it in an immoral way, and then you didn't achieve the goal that you wanted. Because from the Russian perspective, if you're already being given this, what incentive do you have to make peace if you're already being given this right now on just on the walkway? You're not even there yet. And so the idea of Trump making this concession now as a way to pressure the Ukrainians, well, then you give up leverage to pressure the Russians, the party that has been the most difficult to get to the table and to cooperate. So I see this as a loser for Trump. I see this as a loser for Ukraine. I see this as a loser for Europe. I obviously see this as a loser for the United States. The only party that I think succeeds in getting closer to their goals from this is the Russian Federation. And so I think this is obviously a ridiculous move. But it has not yet formally been declared. But if and when that happens, it's going to be very interesting to watch Russian reaction. Because if nothing changes on the battlefield and everything continues, then we continue to just give Putin goodie bags, both in Alaska, PR-wise, and in concessions when it comes to the actual terms, with no results getting us closer to peace, which was Trump's stated goal. Moldova is definitely next. I mean, it's definitely one of the biggest fears.